All right, great. Well, thanks, everyone. I thought by way of introduction starting, maybe we could talk a little bit about the areas that we're most interested in or most exciting right now. Sheila, maybe you can start in terms of the World Economic Forum. What are you most excited about in terms of areas that are going to have the most impact in the near term for blockchain?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So the forum focuses on policy interventions. We're not really looking or working in proof of concept or prototyping of specific products. And so I think what I'm most excited about are policies and products that really focus on citizen empowerment. So whether that's the advent of digital identity solutions, where we can give people control over their identities, their data, how they are actually seen and tracked through the world, having actually some modicum of control over that, I think is going to be a real game changer in terms of how we interact with each other, and frankly, both in real life and also virtually. I also think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in areas that may seem less sexy, but are going to be really good proof cases. So there's a lot of work happening in supply chain, I think that's really exciting, where we're kind of eliminating paper or reducing paper, and it's forcing us to really think about what data we collect, what's really important, how do we hash it, what do we hash, how do we clean it up, and I think that that pre-work almost is as exciting to me as some of the applications themselves.
Mm-hmm. Great. Brian, Hyperledger's really active in a lot of different industries. What do you see happening, and what do you see sort of coming out into the real world?
Sure. Well, we're seeing now we're at a moment where we're transitioning from a lot of R&D work being done and people kind of playing with the technology, trying to understand its limitations and its capabilities, to putting these into production. Right. So a few weeks ago, the We.Trade network launched, which is a trade finance platform for small, mid-sized businesses with HSBC, Deutsche Bank, Santander, and about 10 other banks. And that's in production now. It's conducting real transactions. That's pretty exciting. And there's various supply chain-related platforms that are now running, whether it's diamonds or fish or food traceability or medical marijuana. There's actually a medical marijuana supply chain.
Right.
Great company.
Pharmaceuticals, yes, exactly. And there's running systems now on top of this technology. This is not, let's wait 5 years and see what happens. This is real today.
This is happening now.
This is happening now. And within Hyperledger, we're seeing kind of some degree of escape velocity being achieved. We have had over 600 different developers contribute to the 10 different projects at Hyperledger. We've got 60 different companies now building products and services on top of the different code bases. We wake up pretty much every week to 1 or 2 new projects launching and being announced that we had never heard about. Certainly people can use open source software without asking our permission, without getting it plugged into our network or anything like that. And that's good, because that's a sign that I think you've crossed the chasm, to use Jeffrey Moore's phrase.
Yeah, great. Nick, in terms of ConsenSys, you guys are in a lot of different areas, across various different projects. What's the latest from ConsenSys? What are you guys working on?
Well, we're obviously trying to help build the ecosystem. Brian alluded to the size of the the Hyperledger ecosystem. It's got a ways to go to catch up to Ethereum, of course, but that's okay. We recognize that there's space in this area for many blockchains. If you're a golfer, you use a different club based on the lie of the ball. We believe that over time, you'll have fewer clubs to choose from, or fewer clubs you have to choose from. Instead of carrying all 12 or 13 in your bag, you may need 2 or 3. Certainly areas around supply chain, identity, new work being done around real estate and tokenization of real estate to open up investing to the, democratizing investing, if you will. Legal contracts getting parsed and put on the blockchain to execute in a kind of executing fashion. Many exciting projects.
Yeah, great. We spoke a little bit before this panel about, on the global level, how companies are implementing blockchain and where they're implementing them. Sheila, can you talk a little about that in terms of what you're seeing shopping for territories and places to implement blockchain?
Sure. It's interesting to me how we're seeing still a lot of forum shopping. And so forum shopping is a legal term. It basically means that you kind of choose your venue or jurisdiction. And the legal context, it means where you think you're going to get a favorable jury and judge. So in this context, in the tech context, it kind of means you build where you think it's likely or real that regulation and policy are going to support what you're trying to do. Maybe there's a tax structure that kind of works for you. And we've seen different examples of this. And one thing I find really interesting is, we are trying to build, all of us here, whether it's a policy layer or a protocol layer, we're trying to build something that really is global. Like when you think about the analogy, which I think we all hate, but it is apt in this case, of blockchain technology to the internet, it's a global phenomenon, right? And yes, there are different countries that have cut off transmission, flow, net neutrality. Like there's varying ways that the internet functions differently in different countries, but fundamentally, the internet is pretty standard across jurisdictions. We're actually seeing interesting things happening with blockchain technology. And because the equation of cryptocurrency regulation and that regulatory space really affects the way people think about DLT in a particular regulatory context, you're seeing different kinds of companies or apps or dApps start up in different places. So to me, I think it's important that we take a step back and really examine and explore what are the follow-on consequences to that. If we are seeing tremendous build of certain kind in China, and we're seeing opposite kind of build or different kind of build in Switzerland, what does that mean? Is that important? I think it is.
Mm-hmm. For both of you guys, feel free to jump in. It seems like you're seeing companies across those different geographies also.
Across the geographies, and you're also seeing sovereign nation states that have been maybe underrepresented or see this as an opportunity to leapfrog their status, being very aggressive on establishing regulation and centers of excellence and what have you. Time will tell if that plays out and that works in their favor. I hope so. It'd be nice.
What do you think companies or new projects should think about when they're thinking about starting a new entity, whether it's a company or a blockchain? What do you think about that, Brian?
The first thing I really encourage them to think about is whether they really need blockchain or not. Right. We get a fair amount of interest from last year's database projects, and we try to gently, sometimes not so gently, help people move away from those, because at the end of the day, technology, the value of the technology, and the people's willingness to adopt it will be based on that value. So,
Brian?
I think one thing that's a challenge for a lot of people to understand in this space, investors, businesses, et cetera, is that blockchains are not a faster way to do anything. They're not a big data tool. They're not necessarily a way to cut fees, right? Or even a way to launch technology more quickly. They're a technical solution to what is really a market structure problem, which is, in a lot of the tech world, we oriented ourselves around platform plays, right? Everyone wants to be the Uber of something, right? They want to be that entity in the center that gets to kind of play God. And blockchain technology is all about the inverse of that, about enabling an ecosystem play. And there are some companies that actually thrive in kind of ecosystem plays. They're the ones who provide software and services and support to the different parties in an ecosystem. But it's not the traditional venture capital kind of like driven kind of view of how the world should work. You should want to be the Uber and such. So for existing incumbents in a marketplace who are not themselves the platform everyone builds on top of, this is a really compelling way to preserve that position, to perhaps disrupt somebody who is at the center of a market and charging a lot of money to conduct transactions through it. But it's not necessarily the path to easy riches that it might seem like. And so that's what really a lot of organizations, I think, are realizing with blockchain technology.
Or the path to lower cost, right? You mentioned the complexity of some of these systems, especially when you're trying to get multiple disparate parties to agree and integrate things, and they can be very complex, very cumbersome. In some cases, unfortunately, brittle, right? Fortunately, the technology is maturing. There are other options evolving that make it easier to adopt and practice and play with this technology, and it's going to get better every day. Yeah.
So the attractiveness of implementing blockchain for a company differs based on where you sit in that particular time, whether you're a platform play, whether you're a traditional big company, whether you're a startup, and how that would benefit you.
Exactly. I think it's the case where even if you're one of the largest retailers in the United States, right? If you're sourcing products and you're sourcing food and other objects from a global supply chain, you want to implement a global traceability system so that when bad product shows up in your market, you want to be able to narrow down and to figure out where exactly that came from, so you're not banning all lettuce from California, for example, right? Even if you're the largest retailer, you don't necessarily have the market strength to go to the rest of the world and say, all right, anytime a pig farmer in China hands off a pig to a processor, right, to an abattoir or something like that, we want you to issue a transaction to the big retailer's web services API so we can trace this all the way through. Instead, if you go to that marketplace and you say, let's build up a mutual system, let's build up a blockchain network where each of us are peers on that network, where we each run a node on that network, and for the intrinsic value of the traceability we get, the retailer and being able to quickly narrow down and figure out how do we prevent bad product from hitting our shelves, but also the producers, so those who actually do invest in better cleanliness or better quality product can get rewarded for doing that and shown to be the good actors in that marketplace. Everybody has that intrinsic interest in being a part of that. That will exist in some spaces. Supply chains are great there. Other types of paperwork-intensive processes around permits, all the government kind of use cases we can think about. But it's not necessarily the case in, say, ride-hailing, for example, right? It may be the case that the shape of the ride-hailing industry favors a few large providers like Uber and Lyft and that sort of thing, at least for the foreseeable future.
But here's what's interesting, right? When you're talking about, in addition to that, when you're talking about disrupting a new space, there's still competitive impulses, both in business and among people. So what we're seeing is where there's a unilateral solution or a bilateral solution, you're seeing a failure to adopt by competitors, which is completely understandable and normal. And so one of the things we're trying to do is say, how do you get beyond that? How do you say that a bilateral solution to a global supply chain is not going to solve the problem? It's not going to get universal adoption in the way that I would hope that we're still at such an early phase of this technology. We should be thinking really, really big. How do we, scalability, technical scalability is not the only obstacle to scalability, right? It's also just the willingness of companies who are competitors or countries who are competitors or perceived enemies to actually engage in adoption too.
And there's a lot of talk about disintermediation, and I think it's overplayed in this space because even though the value of blockchain allows counterparties to recognize the greater value of the transaction instead of an intermediary, I think there's a huge role that intermediaries play. Brian talked about the Uber and Airbnb example. They're an intermediary that actually adds value. If it wasn't for Uber, we probably, or Flywheel, I don't know if Wolpert's in the audience, they probably wouldn't have ride sharing today, right? However, now that ride sharing has become accepted, almost ubiquitous, unless you don't have a banking account. Do you need Uber? Or can you use a service from an insurance company that allows you to find a reputable driver that drives the kind of car you want to ride and their schedule, their own calendar that says they're available and are willing to give you a ride, and then match it together? That doesn't mean that transaction happens without intermediaries. It's just the intermediaries are extracting the value based on the value they're putting in.
And I think it will lead to a new kind of intermediary as well, if I can just jump in.
Yeah.
Where, but blockchains still need somebody and some governance mechanism to decide two sets of things. One is, what are the technical standards that we're going to use on this ledger? What protocols, how much flexibility do we provide to smart contract systems, et cetera? And some degree of human governance. What happens when a bug is discovered and somebody steals assets? What happens when we want to agree on a contentious new technical approach to take with the platform? What happens when there's a bad actor who follows all the rules but still is able to front-run the market or find some way to exploit that, right? And these will still require some organization. It could be a small little startup company, actually, that everybody mutually distrusts. It could be a large company that comes in and bootstraps these things. But the term that's been evolving has been governing entity, right? And they might be existing consortia out there that serve this role. They might be brand new types of organizations that do this. But one thing that blockchains let us do is, well, if we think metaphorically about the governing entity being like a referee on a football field, they're not playing the game. They're just watching for violations. They're trying to kind of keep the game going. But if they go crazy, if they start making up rules on the spot, if they start charging players to come onto the field an unreasonable amount or anything at all, they can be fired. And this is an important thing in these permission ledger systems and these blockchain systems. For everyone's benefit, for everyone's maximal benefit, I think the network operators, these governing entities, will need to practice some degree of minimum viable centralization, right? To be the kind of entity everyone can trust because their processes are objective, they are transparent, and they're minimal. And if they do go out of those boxes, that they can be replaced by somebody else. And that's, I think, going to contain the abuses that we see in other centralized kind of data systems that we're trying to build this technology to get us away from in the first place.
I think that's a great vision. I think in practice, we've got a long way to go to get there. Sorry, Sheila.
I think I agree with you, Brian. I think that fundamentally, I think that even though this has proven to be totally irrational, psychologically, people still like to have a place they can point to. Like, decentralization is an amazing theoretical concept, and I think to those of us deep in this space, we understand and can visualize what that world looks like. But it's a really big leap for a lot of people. And even though, trust in institutions, right, is at an all-time low for very good reasons, people still expect and like to see an institution that they can hold accountable, and they don't understand how that accountability transfers onto a decentralized system or into a decentralized ecosystem. So there's a lot of education we need to do, even at the sort of citizen level, about what this means, how it actually is a form of protection, not a form of release of accountability. It's quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, to that point, Brian, you talked about that in terms of governance. How does that play out in terms of, say, certain industries or industry consortia decide, okay, we're going to set up this blockchain for healthcare or seafood, and then how do you ensure that all stakeholders, consumers, and everyone is involved to make sure that it's not just an industry consortium?
How do you make sure of that? Well, I think a lot of these, networks will be set up by the participants in the marketplace, right? And I think many of them will recognize they sit in regulated industries, and so it's probably wise to have a regulator as a part of that process. They'll probably sit in spaces where there's a consumer demand for certain social impact kind of measures, like whether it's a treaty thing like in the fishing industry, for example, where you want to catch things within quota, or organic food, or those sorts of things. So having actually members of civil society or nonprofits involved as well in the design of those networks is probably going to pay off. I think there'll also be competition between these networks. And the networks that have the rules that are easier to join, that are able to accommodate the 21st participant, the 201st participant, will naturally have a competitive advantage over those networks that are more closed. Because I think Metcalfe's law still applies, where the value of a network is the square of the number of participants, up to some limit, but I think those networks that are easier to join will have that competitive advantage.
So users will be able to vote with their usage based on the governance that's applied or not.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah. Right, that's the incentive model. Sheila?
Yeah, let's get back to what I was saying about the competitive instinct. So we are seeing that bilateral solutions don't get adopted at scale. They don't get picked up by other players. And so there's going to be market force that really pushes institutions and companies, et cetera, governments even, to think bigger, to include more stakeholders, to talk to civil societies, talk to other governments, to talk to different sectors and stakeholders to ensure that what they're building actually has potential to be sticky.
Well, we're getting ready to wrap up here, but I thought we'd do a quick speed round, maybe give you each a last say here. We want to just say one thing that you're really think is a big challenge for blockchain developing in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, I'll say two things. One is straight up the number of developers in the space. We are short on developers, need a lot more of them. Second is entrenched power structures. There are a lot of embedded interests that have a lot of investment in their existing structures, and I think we underestimate how challenging it is to actually change that and disrupt it.
Like, is this the internet again, or
it takes time.
Right.
Yeah, for me, it's likewise on the developer side. Getting this to be something that developers can pick up very quickly and start working with and building proofs of concept, running pilots, and also understanding the pattern of how to go from a successful pilot to a running production system, and being able to scale and manage that scalability in the same way that today you can with a website. And today you don't have to worry about the slashdot effect like you might have had to 10 years ago, because we know how to scale these things, right? And the second is end user kind of experiences through around this, what I think really will be a reinvention of how digital identity works, towards this kind of concept called self-sovereign identity, trying to turn away from the mainframe view of all of your data sitting on a remote server to now your data sitting very locally with you, with permissioning and consent recorded using distributed ledgers. This is a huge topic, and I think it'll positively impact us as a society, but it'll take a few years to roll out, and I really worry about the end user experience of that being what it needs to be.
One of the keys being interoperability, right? If you've got an identity construct and you've got a network of chains, being able to have a consistent identity context that can follow that transaction across multiple chains in a bidirectional fashion would be huge. You mentioned the scalability and the privacy challenges. Many of them are being addressed, hopefully in the very short term, hopefully in the next 12 months on the public chain. It's going to be a great future.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, I think we're about out of time, but thanks so much for the panel.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.